Have you ever felt that your prayers seem to drift into emptiness? That sensation when you pour your heart out to God, and yet the heavens remain silent. Picture this. A young boy kneels beside his bed, tears streaming down his face after being excluded from games at school. His small hands clasp tightly as he whispers prayers learned from his grandmother. No one sees him. No one hears him. At least, that's what he believes. The world has rejected him, and now it seems even God has turned away. The crushing weight of loneliness presses down on his small shoulders. You've felt this too, haven't you? That moment when rejection makes you question your very worth. When even your spiritual life offers no immediate comfort. When prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling and return empty. What if I told you that in these moments of profound loneliness, when human connection fails us, we might be closest to experiencing a divine encounter? This was true for an 8-year-old boy whose seemingly unanswered prayers opened the door to a transformative spiritual vision. And it was true for Ignatius of Loyola, whose greatest spiritual insights came not in moments of glory, but in periods of rejection and isolation. The space between our deepest wounds and our most profound spiritual encounters might be much narrower than we imagine. When we think about meaningful prayer, we often imagine something dramatic, perhaps a moment of intense emotion, tears flowing freely as heavenly light breaks through the clouds, or a sudden resolution to our problems that proves God was listening all along. We've been conditioned to expect immediate results, like customers at a spiritual drive-through window. But authentic prayer, as Ignatius of Loyola discovered, exists in a different dimension altogether. It isn't merely about getting what we want, but about transforming who we are. Consider our young boy, rejected by his peers and feeling abandoned by God. His prayers weren't immediately answered in the way he hoped. No friend suddenly appeared at his door with apologies. No teacher noticed his isolation. Instead, something far more significant occurred. Something that would reshape his understanding of prayer itself. You see, prayer in the Ignatian tradition isn't primarily a transaction, it's an invitation to relationship. And relationships, as we know, aren't built on immediate gratification, but on faithful presence. This runs contrary to our contemporary expectation of instant results. We tap our phones and food arrives at our doorstep. We click a button and entertainment streams into our homes. We post on social media and validation arrives in the form of likes and comments. Yet the spiritual life operates according to different principles that Ignatius understood profoundly. For him, the seemingly silent moments of prayer were not evidence of divine absence, but opportunities for deeper presence. What appeared to be rejection was actually an invitation to a more authentic relationship. This insight came to Ignatius not during his years of worldly success as a courtier and soldier, but during his time of profound isolation and suffering. After being severely wounded in battle, his leg shattered by a cannonball, he endured excruciating surgeries without anesthesia. Confined to a bed and facing the collapse of his military ambitions, Ignatius experienced a form of rejection from the life he had known. His prayers during this time might have seemed futile. He asked for entertaining knight's tales to read during his convalescence, but only received religious texts instead. He prayed for his leg to heal properly, yet was left with a lifelong limp. By conventional standards, these prayers went unanswered. But through this apparent silence, Ignatius encountered something far greater than what he had originally sought. Our young boy's experience parallels this journey. His immediate prayers for friendship and acceptance seemed to go unheard. But in that sacred space of vulnerability, something unexpected was taking shape. Just as Ignatius found his greatest spiritual awakening in his moment of physical limitation, this child would discover that rejection had opened a door to an encounter that would change the course of his life. This is the first paradox of Ignatian spirituality that so many of us miss. Often, it's precisely when we feel most alone, most rejected, that we stand on the threshold of our most significant spiritual breakthroughs. But what does this look like in practical terms? How do we navigate those painful moments when our prayers seem to evaporate into silence? Ignatius offers us a profound framework through what he called the discernment of spirits. For him, spiritual life wasn't a straightforward upward trajectory, but a complex interplay of consolation and desolation. Consolation might be understood as those moments when we feel God's presence clearly, when prayer comes easily, when spiritual insights arrive like gifts. Desolation, on the other hand, describes those periods of dryness, doubt, and apparent divine absence when our prayers seem to hit a wall. Most of us naturally prefer consolation and interpret desolation as failure or divine rejection. But Ignatius saw something different. He recognized that desolation, while painful, often serves as the crucible for our deepest growth. Our young boy, kneeling alone by his bed night after night, was experiencing a form of spiritual desolation. His prayers didn't immediately change his external circumstances. The children at school continued to exclude him. His sense of loneliness persisted. By superficial measures, his prayers were failing. Yet within this apparent failure, something remarkable was unfolding. The soil of his heart, tilled by suffering and watered by tears, was being prepared for a seed that would grow into something beyond his imagination. This mirrors Ignatius's own journey, where the desolation of his convalescence became the birthplace of his conversion. Had his initial prayers been answered according to his wishes, he might have returned to military service, pursuing worldly glory. Instead, his apparent rejection opened the path to becoming one of the Church's most influential spiritual leaders. In the spiritual classic, The Imitation of Christ, which Ignatius read during his convalescence, there's a line that says, "God speaks to us when the world is silent." For both our young boy and for Ignatius, rejection created a silence in which a deeper voice could be heard. Consider how rarely we experience true silence in our lives today. We're constantly surrounded by noise, notifications, and voices competing for our attention. Perhaps this is why we struggle to hear the divine whisper. We've lost the art of holy listening that grows most fertile in moments of apparent abandonment. You might be experiencing such a moment right now. Perhaps you've prayed for healing, reconciliation, or guidance, and heaven seems bronze above you. You might interpret this silence as rejection, evidence that your prayers lack power or that God has turned away. But what if, like Ignatius, like our young boy, you're actually standing at the threshold of your most significant spiritual encounter? What if the silence isn't absence but preparation? Before we continue exploring the extraordinary encounter that awaited our young boy, I'd like to pause for a moment and connect with you personally. Have you ever experienced a time when your prayers seemed to go unanswered, when the silence felt deafening and God seemed distant? That period when, despite your sincere efforts to reach out to the divine, all you encountered was what seemed like emptiness? I want you to know that this experience is not only common, but often precedes our deepest spiritual growth. Saint Ignatius himself experienced what he called spiritual desolation. Those dark nights of the soul where God's presence feels distant. If this resonates with your experience, I invite you to share in the comments by simply writing, "I have walked through the silence." Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in their own spiritual journey. Sometimes, acknowledging our moments of felt absence creates space for a new kind of presence, both divine and communal. By sharing your experience, you not only process your own spiritual journey, but potentially become a light for others walking similar paths. Now, let's return to our young boy and the extraordinary encounter that awaited him after those seemingly unanswered prayers. That night, after another day of rejection at school, another evening of tears and desperate prayers, the exhausted child finally fell asleep. And in the vulnerable space between consciousness and dreams, something remarkable occurred. A figure appeared to him, a man dressed in simple black robes with kind yet penetrating eyes, eyes that seemed to see through all pretense into the very core of his being. "I am Ignatius," the figure said gently, "and I have come because your prayers have been heard." The boy, half afraid and half captivated, could only whisper, "But nothing has changed. The children still won't play with me." The man smiled, a smile that contained both infinite compassion and gentle challenge. "Not all answers come in the form we expect," Ignatius replied. "Sometimes the greatest gift is not the changing of our circumstances, but the transformation of our vision." This nocturnal encounter, whether understood as dream, vision, or the imaginative working of grace, represents something profound about Ignatian spirituality. For Ignatius, God is not distant and unreachable, but intimately involved in our lives, speaking to us through our experiences, emotions, and yes, even our imagination. What makes this encounter particularly Ignatian is how it bridges the supernatural and the deeply human. Ignatius doesn't appear as a remote, glowing saint surrounded by clouds of glory, but as an approachable figure who addresses the boy's specific pain with both tenderness and truth. This reflects one of Ignatius's most revolutionary insights, that God meets us in the particularity of our lives, speaking not in generic platitudes, but to our unique circumstances and wounds. The conversation between the boy and Ignatius continues as the saint begins to guide him through what amounts to a child's version of the spiritual exercises, Ignatius's masterwork of spiritual formation. "Look at your hands," Ignatius instructs the boy. "These are the same hands that God formed with care. Now place them over your heart. Feel its beating. This rhythm has continued since before you were born, a gift you did nothing to earn." The boy follows these instructions, experiencing a new awareness of his body not as something shameful or inadequate, the source of his rejection by peers, but as something fearfully and wonderfully made. Next, Ignatius guides him through a form of what would later be called the exam, a prayerful review of his day. "Where did you feel joy today?" Ignatius asks. The boy thinks hard, pushing past the dominant memories of rejection to recall a small flower he noticed on the way to school, the taste of his mother's cooking, the warm sun on his face during recess even as he stood alone. "Now," Ignatius continues, "where did you feel sorrow?" "Here." The answers come quickly. The laughter of other children as they excluded him, the empty space beside him at lunch, the games he watched but couldn't join. With each memory, tears well up again. "Feel these emotions fully," Ignatius encourages him. "Don't push them away. God is present in both your joy and your sorrow." This teaching, radical in its embrace of the full spectrum of human emotion as the arena of divine activity, forms the cornerstone of Ignatian spirituality. Unlike spiritual approaches that encourage detachment from emotions or that label some feelings as spiritual and others as carnal, Ignatius recognized that our entire emotional life offers pathways to encounter God. This is why the spiritual exercises begin not with abstract theological concepts, but with the principle and foundation, an acknowledgement of our creation by and for God, and continue through meditations that engage our imagination, memory, and feelings. For Ignatius, the spiritual life is not about escaping our humanity, but about allowing our humanity to become transparent to the divine. Our young boy is experiencing precisely this kind of formation through his dream encounter. He's not being told to ignore his pain or to simply pray harder for different circumstances. Instead, he's being guided to find God's presence within his current reality, however difficult. But Ignatius doesn't stop there. He continues to guide the boy toward a deeper understanding of his situation, helping him see beyond the immediate circumstances to their spiritual significance. "The rejection you feel is painful," Ignatius acknowledges, "and I won't pretend it isn't. I too have known rejection. When my leg was shattered and my military career ended, I felt cast aside, useless. When I began to speak of spiritual things, former friends mocked me. When I tried to travel to the Holy Land, circumstances blocked my path repeatedly." The boy listens, surprised that this holy figure had experienced similar feelings to his own. But in each rejection, Ignatius continues, "I gradually discovered an invitation. When military glory was taken from me, I found a deeper calling. When worldly friends turned away, spiritual companions took their place. When one path closed, another opened that I couldn't have imagined." For Ignatius, this represented what he called the third degree of humility, a state where one so desires to be with Christ that one welcomes even hardship and rejection if it draws one closer to him. This is not a masochistic embrace of suffering for its own sake, but a recognition that sometimes our greatest spiritual growth occurs precisely when our worldly attachments are stripped away. Our young boy isn't yet ready for such advanced spiritual concepts, but the seed is being planted. Through this encounter, he's beginning to intuit that his value doesn't depend on peer acceptance, that his identity runs deeper than social inclusion, and that his apparent abandonment might actually be making space for a more profound belonging. This insight forms the theological heart of Ignatian spirituality, what might be called a spirituality of finding God in all things, even in experiences of rejection and apparent divine silence. It represents a radical reframing of spiritual life, not as an escape from difficulty, but as a deeper engagement with reality, illuminated by faith. For our young boy, this encounter is initiating a transformation not of his external circumstances, but of his interior vision. And this changed vision will, in time, change everything else as well. But how exactly does this transformation occur? The Ignatian approach is both mystical and intensely practical. In the boy's dream, Ignatius now guides him through a form of contemplation, another cornerstone of Ignatian prayer. Close your eyes, he instructs, and imagine Jesus sitting beside you at school during lunch. What does he say to you? How does he look at you? The boy's imagination, formed by Bible stories and Sunday school lessons, easily conjures the image. Jesus sits beside him on the bench, sharing his loneliness. He doesn't immediately call the other children over or perform a miracle to make them include the boy. He simply sits in solidarity, his presence a comfort in itself. What do you notice? Ignatius asks. The boy considers. He seems sad that I'm alone, but not worried or angry, the boy replies. And he's still with me, even though the cool kids aren't. This simple exercise, adapted for a child but containing the essence of Ignatian contemplation, is working a profound shift in the boy's perspective. He's beginning to see his situation through the eyes of faith, to recognize a presence that persists even amid apparent absence. This is the genius of Ignatian spirituality, its ability to bridge heaven and earth through the sanctified use of imagination. Unlike some spiritual traditions that view imagination with suspicion, seeing it as a potential source of distraction or illusion, Ignatius recognized it as a God-given faculty through which divine communication often occurs. In his spiritual exercises, imagination serves as the theater where Scripture comes alive, where we don't merely read about Jesus, but encounter him directly, placing ourselves within the gospel scenes. For our young boy, this imaginative contemplation isn't mere fantasy or wishful thinking. It's a genuine spiritual exercise that makes tangible what faith affirms but the senses cannot yet perceive, the real presence of Christ in his loneliness. Through this exercise, the boy begins to experience what Ignatius called consolation, not as an emotional high but as an increase in faith, hope, and love, even amid difficult circumstances. This consolation doesn't erase his pain or instantly solve his problems, but it places them in a new context, illuminated by a light that transforms their meaning. And this points to another crucial aspect of Ignatian spirituality, its insistence that genuine spiritual growth isn't measured by the absence of problems, but by a new capacity to engage them from a place of greater freedom and faith. What would change for you, Ignatius asks the boy, if you knew that Jesus sits with you each day, even when you feel most alone? The boy considers this question seriously. I'd still be sad about not having friends, he admits honestly, but I wouldn't feel like nobody cares about me. And maybe I could look for other kids who are alone and sit with them, like Jesus sits with me. Here we see the fruit of Ignatian contemplation beginning to form, the movement from insight to action, from changed perception to changed behavior. This integration of contemplation and action, what Ignatius called being a contemplative in action, represents one of his most significant contributions to spirituality. For him, prayer that doesn't lead to concrete change in how we live remains incomplete. True contemplation naturally overflows into compassionate action. Our young boy, though just beginning this journey, already intuits this connection. His imaginative experience of Christ's solidarity with him awakens a desire to extend that same solidarity to others. This represents the first stirring of what Ignatius would call the magis, the more universal good, the movement beyond self-concern toward service. And it emerges not through moral exhortation, but as the natural fruit of encounter. The boy's dream continues as Ignatius guides him deeper still, toward what might be understood as a child's version of the two standards meditation from the spiritual exercises. In this exercise, Ignatius invites retreatants to visualize two camps, one led by Christ, the other by the enemy of human nature, each with its own strategy and values. Imagine the playground tomorrow, Ignatius suggests to the boy. On one side are the children who exclude others, who decide who's worthy of friendship based on popularity or athletic ability or the right clothes. This is one standard, one way of seeing the world. Now imagine another group, maybe not as visible, of children who include others, who look for the lonely, who value kindness above coolness. This is another standard. Which would you rather belong to? The boy doesn't hesitate. The second group, but they're harder to find, he adds realistically. Yes, Ignatius agrees, the way of love often is. But it exists, and more importantly, you can help create it by your own choices. In this simple dialogue, the boy is being introduced to a profound spiritual concept, the recognition that we constantly choose between competing value systems, between the way of Christ and the way of the world, and that our choices gradually shape not only our own character, but the communities we inhabit. This brings us to another essential element of Ignatian spirituality, what might be called the transformative power of daily choices. For Ignatius, spiritual life isn't primarily composed of dramatic moments of conversion, but of countless small decisions that gradually orient us toward or away from God. Our young boy is beginning to grasp this truth, to see that while he cannot control whether others include him, he can control his own responses, his own values, his own choices to include or exclude. And these choices matter, not just morally but spiritually, as they gradually shape his character and his capacity to receive and reflect divine love. The dream encounter begins to draw to a close as dawn approaches. Before departing, Ignatius offers the boy a final gift, a simple prayer practice to carry with him into his waking life. Each night before sleep, he instructs, take a few moments to review your day. Notice where you felt joy and where you felt sorrow. Look for moments when you sensed God's presence, even faintly. Give thanks for these glimpses of grace. Then look for moments when you turned away from love, when fear or anger closed your heart. Ask for forgiveness and healing. Finally, entrust tomorrow to God's care. This practice, a simplified version of the exam that Ignatius considered indispensable for spiritual growth, offers the boy a concrete way to integrate his dream encounter into daily life. It provides a structure for ongoing conversation with God that doesn't depend on emotional intensity or immediate answers, but on faithful attention to the divine presence woven through ordinary experience. With these words, Ignatius begins to fade from the boy's dream. "Wait," the child calls out. "Will I see you again?" Ignatius smiles warmly. "I remain with you in a different way," he assures the boy. "When you practice what I've shared, when you look for God's presence in both joy and sorrow, when you choose the standard of Christ over the standard of the world, I am there, and more importantly, Christ is there." With these words, the dream ends, and the boy wakes to early morning light filtering through his window. The rejection he faces at school hasn't magically disappeared overnight. The children who excluded him yesterday will likely exclude him today, but something has changed within him. A shift in perspective that will gradually transform how he experiences and responds to his situation. This change doesn't trivialize his pain or suggest that his longing for friendship is unimportant. Rather, it places that pain and longing in a larger context, one illuminated by faith and expanded by hope. And from this new vantage point, different possibilities begin to emerge. What might this look like in practical terms? How does our young boy's encounter with Ignatius translate into his daily experience? Let's follow him through the day after his dream to see how the seeds planted during the night might begin to sprout in the light of ordinary life. As he prepares for school, the memory of his dream remains vivid, not fading like ordinary dreams, but retaining its clarity and emotional impact. While eating breakfast, he finds himself noticing small joys he might previously have overlooked. The sunlight on the kitchen table, the taste of maple syrup, his mother's hand briefly touching his hair as she passes. He recalls Ignatius's guidance about finding God in all things and wonders if God might be present in these ordinary pleasures. Walking to school, anxiety still tightens his stomach as he anticipates another day of exclusion. But alongside this familiar fear, a new awareness flickers. If Jesus walks beside me even when I'm alone, he thinks, then I'm never really alone, even when it feels that way. This thought doesn't eliminate his nervousness, but creates a small space of comfort within it. Arriving at school, he sees the usual groups forming on the playground, the popular children gathering in the center, others orbiting around them, hoping for inclusion. His usual spot is along the fence, watching but not participating. Today, though, he notices something he hadn't before. Another boy sitting alone, reading a book beneath a tree. Ordinarily, he might have overlooked this solitary figure, too absorbed in his own rejection to notice another's isolation. But Ignatius's words echo in his memory. Maybe I could look for other kids who are alone and sit with them, like Jesus sits with me. After a moment's hesitation, he walks over and sits nearby. "What are you reading?" he asks shyly. The other boy looks up, surprised but not unwelcoming. "It's about dinosaurs," he replies, showing a page of colorful illustrations. This simple interaction, initiated not from a place of desperate need, but from newly awakened compassion marks the beginning of a subtle but significant shift. He's no longer merely a passive recipient of rejection, but an active agent of inclusion. And in extending friendship to another lonely child, he paradoxically begins to address his own loneliness. This doesn't mean all his problems are immediately solved. During class, he still feels the sting when teams are chosen for activities and he's picked last. At lunch, the table of popular kids still excludes him. But alongside these familiar pains, new possibilities are emerging. He and the dinosaur-loving boy sit together at lunch, their shared marginal status creating a bond that might, in time, grow into genuine friendship. And as he practices the awareness Ignatius taught him, he begins to notice other children in similar situations. The quiet girl who never speaks in class, the boy with a disability who struggles to keep up in gym. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, his focus shifts from what he lacks to what he can offer, from his own wounds to the wounds of others that he might help heal. This represents what Ignatius would call the fruit of consolation. Not a superficial emotional uplift, but a genuine increase in faith, hope, and love that expresses itself in action. By day's end, the boy's external circumstances haven't dramatically changed. He hasn't suddenly become popular or been embraced by the in-crowd, but his interior landscape has begun to shift in ways that will, over time, transform his experience of those circumstances. Returning home, he remembers Ignatius's instructions about the nightly prayer practice. Before sleep, he reviews his day, noticing moments of both joy and sorrow, looking for traces of divine presence, acknowledging mistakes, and entrusting tomorrow to God's care. This simple discipline, practiced faithfully night after night, will gradually deepen the transformation begun in his dream encounter, teaching him to find God not just in dramatic spiritual experiences, but in the texture of ordinary life. This integration of the mystical and the mundane lies at the heart of Ignatian spirituality. For Ignatius, spiritual growth doesn't primarily occur through extraordinary visions, though these may sometimes play a role, but through the patient cultivation of awareness and the gradual reorientation of desires toward God. Our young boy is just beginning this journey, taking the first steps on a path that will lead him not away from his humanity, but deeper into it, where he will discover that his deepest human longings find their ultimate fulfillment not in worldly acceptance, but in divine love. And this discovery, while not eliminating his natural desire for friendship, will place that desire in a new context, freeing him from the desperate need that makes rejection so devastating. Over the weeks and months that follow, the seeds planted in his dream encounter continue to grow. The friendship with the dinosaur-loving boy deepens and expands to include other children on the margins. Together, they create a small community characterized not by popularity or athletic prowess, but by genuine acceptance and shared interests. The boy continues his nightly exam, gradually developing a more nuanced awareness of interior movements, learning to distinguish between what Ignatius would call consolation and desolation, between those influences that draw him toward greater love and those that pull him toward fear and self-absorption. He begins to notice patterns, how certain thoughts lead toward greater freedom, while others lead toward contraction and anxiety. This growing self-knowledge, illuminated by faith, enables him to make choices more aligned with his deepest values, rather than reacting automatically to external pressures or internal impulses. The memory of his dream encounter with Ignatius remains a touchstone, a reference point to which he returns especially in difficult moments. When exclusion still hurts, when prayers still seem unanswered, he recalls Ignatius's words about finding invitations within rejections, about God's presence persisting even in apparent absence. This remembrance doesn't magically remove pain, but provides a framework for experiencing it differently, for finding meaning within it rather than being defined by it. As the boy grows older, this childhood spiritual experience continues to shape his development in ways both subtle and profound. The initial focus on his personal pain gradually broadens into a more universal concern, a growing awareness of suffering beyond his own and a desire to address it. The simple practice of looking for excluded children expands into a more general commitment to justice and inclusion. The nightly exam deepens into a more comprehensive prayer life that integrates contemplation and action. The vivid imagination that once allowed him to envision Jesus sitting beside him at lunch now enables him to discover God's presence in an ever-widening range of experiences and relationships. None of this means he becomes perfect or never struggles with rejection again. Throughout adolescence and into adulthood, he will continue to face exclusion in various forms. He will experience periods of spiritual dryness when God seems distant. He will sometimes fail to live up to the values to which he aspires. But the foundation laid through that childhood encounter with Ignatian spirituality provides resources for navigating these challenges with greater resilience and hope. And in time, the wounds that once seemed only painful become transformed into sources of compassion and wisdom that enable him to walk alongside others in their suffering. This transformation of woundedness into gift represents one of the most profound fruits of Ignatian spirituality. Perhaps one of the most beautiful developments in our young boy's journey occurs during his teenage years, when he experiences yet another form of rejection. Now 13, he tries out for the basketball team, practicing for weeks beforehand, shooting baskets in his driveway until his arms ache. When the final roster is posted and his name isn't on it, the old familiar pain of exclusion washes over him. For a moment, he's that 8-year-old again, tears welling up as he stands alone on the playground. But now he has resources he didn't have then. That evening, as he performs his nightly exam, he allows himself to feel the disappointment fully rather than pushing it away. He acknowledges the dream that's been deferred and the questions it raises about his abilities and worth. But then, drawing on years of Ignatian practice, he begins to look beneath the surface of this experience, to ask what invitation might be hidden within this rejection. The answers don't come immediately. For several days, he continues his practice of awareness, noticing how the disappointment affects his thoughts and actions, how it tempts him towards self-pity or resentment. Gradually, through this faithful attention, new insights begin to emerge. He realizes that while he enjoys basketball, his deeper passion lies elsewhere, in music and writing, areas where his gifts find more natural expression. He notices how his experience of rejection has made him more attuned to others' suffering, more likely to see the student eating alone in the cafeteria, or to include the less skilled player in pickup games. He begins to discern that perhaps his calling lies not in achieving conventional success, but in creating spaces of belonging for those the world overlooks, in transforming experiences of rejection into opportunities for greater inclusion. This realization doesn't erase the sting of not making the team, but it does place that disappointment in a larger context of meaning and purpose. And in this new light, what initially seemed like failure begins to look more like redirection toward a path better suited to his unique gifts and calling. This development illustrates another key aspect of Ignatian spirituality, what might be called the discernment of calling or vocation. For Ignatius, each person has a unique role to play in God's ongoing work of creation and redemption, a distinctive way of using their particular gifts to serve the greater good. Discovering this calling involves paying careful attention to both our interior reactions, what brings genuine consolation versus merely temporary pleasure, and our external experiences, including the doors that open and close before us. Our young boy, now entering adolescence, is beginning to engage in precisely this kind of discernment, learning to interpret both his gifts and his limitations as signposts pointing toward his unique path. This doesn't mean the road ahead will be easy or straightforward. There will be further rejections, additional prayers that seem to go unanswered, new forms of spiritual desolation. But each of these challenges will now be experienced not as meaningless suffering, but as part of an ongoing conversation with God, a dialogue conducted not just through words, but through the very texture of lived experience. And in this continuing conversation, our young man will discover that rejection need not have the final word, that unanswered prayers often receive responses we couldn't initially imagine, and that apparent divine silence frequently conceals a deeper kind of speech. As he enters early adulthood, our once rejected boy, now a young man attending college, encounters yet another dimension of Ignatian spirituality that proves crucial for his continuing journey. During a campus ministry retreat, he's introduced to the full spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, the comprehensive program of prayer and meditation that forms the heart of Jesuit formation. Though he's been practicing elements of Ignatian spirituality since his childhood dream encounter, this marks his first exposure to the complete system in its original form. The experience proves both challenging and illuminating. Some aspects feel familiar, like coming home to a place he's always known. The emphasis on finding God in all things resonates with his long-standing practice of the examen. The use of imagination in prayer echoes his childhood experience of envisioning Jesus beside him on the playground. The attention to interior movements of consolation and desolation builds on discernment skills he's been developing for years. But other elements stretch him in new ways, inviting him into deeper waters of spiritual experience. The meditation on sin confronts him with uncomfortable truths about his own capacity for selfishness and self-deception. The contemplation of Christ's life challenges his comfortable religious assumptions and calls him to more radical discipleship. The consideration of different ways of serving God forces him to examine his career plans and life goals with new rigor. Throughout these exercises, he finds himself returning repeatedly to his childhood experience of rejection and seemingly unanswered prayer. But now, with greater maturity and spiritual formation, he sees these early wounds in a different light. What once seemed only painful now appears providential, an invitation into a particular way of knowing God and serving others that might not have been possible without those formative experiences of exclusion and apparent divine silence. This new perspective doesn't romanticize suffering or suggest that God causes rejection in order to teach spiritual lessons. But it does recognize that within our wounds, mysterious grace is often at work, transforming what seems like meaningless pain into unexpected gift. The retreat concludes with what Ignatius called the contemplation to attain love, a prayer exercise designed to help retreatants recognize God's presence and activity in all aspects of creation and respond with generous love. For our young man, this contemplation crystallizes insights that have been gradually forming throughout his life journey. He sees with new clarity how God has been present and active even in his experiences of rejection and unanswered prayer, not causing suffering, but working within it toward healing and transformation. He recognizes more fully how his own wounds have created capacity for compassion toward others' pain, especially those who feel excluded or abandoned. And he discerns with growing conviction that his particular calling involves creating communities of inclusion, where those rejected by the world can discover their true worth and purpose. This recognition doesn't take the form of dramatic revelation, but emerges as a gentle certainty, a deep knowing that feels less like his own conclusion and more like a truth he's been slowly led to discover. As the retreat ends and he returns to ordinary life, he carries this contemplation with him, allowing it to illuminate his daily choices and long-term decisions. And in this continuing integration of prayer and action, of mystical insight and practical service, he embodies the Ignatian ideal of a contemplative in action, someone whose inner life and outer work form a seamless whole oriented toward love. In the years that follow, our once rejected boy, now a mature adult, finds concrete expression for this calling in various forms of service and community building. After college, he works briefly with an urban youth program, creating safe spaces for children experiencing the same kind of exclusion he once knew. Later, he founds a small nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering inclusion for marginalized populations, from immigrants facing cultural rejection to those with disabilities often overlooked by mainstream society. Eventually, he trains as a spiritual director in the Ignatian tradition, helping others navigate their own experiences of apparent divine silence and unanswered prayer. Throughout these endeavors, the foundation laid in that childhood dream encounter with Ignatius continues to sustain and guide him. The nightly exam remains a cornerstone of his spiritual practice, evolving in depth and nuance, but retaining its essential structure of attentive awareness to God's presence in daily experience. The use of imagination in prayer continues to bridge the gap between abstract faith and concrete encounter, allowing him to experience divine companionship even in difficult circumstances. And the fundamental insight that rejection need not define us, that unanswered prayers often receive unexpected responses, and that divine silence frequently conceals deeper speech, remains central to his understanding of spiritual life. This doesn't mean he never struggles or doubts. There are still periods when prayer feels mechanical, when God seems distant, when old wounds of rejection resurface in painful ways. But these challenges no longer threaten to overwhelm him as they once did. Instead, they become occasions for deeper trust, opportunities to reaffirm that what matters most is not the immediate resolution of difficulty, but the faithful presence that persists even when answers aren't forthcoming. What does this story suggest about how we might approach those moments in our own lives when prayers seem unanswered and God seems distant? When rejection, whether from others or apparently from God, leaves us feeling abandoned and alone. First, it invites us to consider that divine silence doesn't necessarily indicate absence. Sometimes, as both Ignatius and our young boy discovered. Apparent abandonment creates space for a deeper kind of presence. The immediate resolution of our problems, the instant fulfillment of our requests, might actually short-circuit a more profound transformation that can only occur through a particular kind of holy waiting. This doesn't mean we should glorify suffering or passively accept injustice, but it does suggest that when quick fixes don't materialize, something deeper might be unfolding. Second, the story reminds us of the power of sanctified imagination in bridging the gap between what faith affirms and what our senses perceive. For Ignatius, imagination wasn't opposed to spiritual authenticity, but often served as its vehicle, allowing truths known abstractly to be experienced concretely. When we can't physically see God's presence in our loneliness, practices like Ignatian contemplation enable us to experience it imaginatively in ways that generate real consolation and lead to genuine change. Finally, the narrative suggests that the integration of our woundedness into our spiritual journey doesn't occur primarily through intellectual understanding, but through a particular kind of attentiveness, a patient, faithful practice of noticing God's presence even in unlikely places, and responding to that presence with increasing freedom and love. When we pray and heaven seems silent, when we feel excluded by others or even by God, we stand in a long tradition of faithful people who have walked similar paths. The psalmist who cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus himself who echoed these words from the cross, Ignatius during his convalescence, Mother Teresa during her long, dark night of the soul, our fictional boy before his dream encounter, and countless others whose names history doesn't record, but whose experiences form part of the great cloud of witnesses. Their testimonies suggest that the journey from rejection to revelation, from abandonment to deeper belonging, represents not an exceptional detour but a central highway of spiritual growth. And they offer hope that our own experiences of apparent divine silence might be preparation not for ultimate disappointment, but for unexpected grace. This doesn't trivialize the real pain of rejection or the genuine anguish of unanswered prayer. It doesn't suggest that suffering is good in itself or that we shouldn't long for its resolution, but it does place these experiences in a larger context, a story not yet finished, a journey whose ultimate destination lies beyond what we can currently see or imagine. And it suggests that the silence that sometimes surrounds our prayers may contain not divine absence, but a deeper kind of presence, one that speaks not in words, but in the slow, patient transformation of our hearts. If you found these reflections on Ignatian spirituality and the transformation of rejection meaningful for your own faith journey, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, where we explore together the timeless wisdom of saints and spiritual masters. Each week, we dive into teachings that can illuminate our path toward a more authentic and vibrant relationship with God. What I love most about this community is that we're all fellow pilgrims, walking alongside each other, sharing our struggles and discoveries with honesty and hope. By subscribing, you'll join a group of seekers who understand that faith isn't about perfect answers, but about faithful presence, about finding God not despite our humanity, but within it. Future videos will explore other aspects of Ignatian spirituality, from the discernment of spirits to contemplation and action, always with an eye toward practical application in our daily lives. I would be truly honored to accompany you on this continuing journey of spiritual growth. Thank you for the gift of your attention and openness during this time together. As we draw our reflection to a close, let's return once more to our young boy, now grown into adulthood, and see how the seeds planted in that childhood encounter have blossomed over time. The man he's become still carries the memory of that dream meeting with Ignatius, not as a distant childhood fantasy, but as a living touchstone that continues to inform his spiritual life. The rejection that once seemed only painful has been transformed into a particular kind of gift, a capacity for compassion that allows him to recognize and respond to the suffering of others with unusual depth. The practices introduced during that nocturnal encounter, especially the examen and contemplation, have evolved into daily disciplines that ground his life in awareness and gratitude. And the initial insight that God might be found even in experiences of apparent absence has expanded into a more comprehensive spirituality of finding God in all things, a way of moving through the world with eyes increasingly attuned to divine presence. None of this means his life has become perfect or free from suffering. He still experiences rejection in various forms, He still encounters periods of spiritual dryness when prayer feels mechanical and God seems distant. He still struggles with the gap between his aspirations and his actions. But these challenges no longer define him or determine his sense of worth. They have become, instead, invitations to deeper trust, opportunities for continued growth, reminders of his ongoing need for grace. And this points to perhaps the most profound fruit of Ignatian spirituality, what might be called a spirituality of imperfection, a way of walking with God that doesn't demand moral flawlessness or spiritual heroism, but only honest presence and continuing openness. Our grown man, like Ignatius himself, has learned that sanctity isn't about achieving some impossible standard of perfection, but about allowing divine love to permeate our messy, complicated humanness more and more fully over time. This insight liberates him from both despair over his failings and complacency about his growth, creating instead a middle path of patient, hopeful perseverance. Looking back on his childhood experience of rejection, he can now see it not as something that happened to him, but as something that happened for him. Not a cruel deprivation, but a difficult gift that opened him to depths of spiritual experience he might otherwise have missed. And in this recognition lies perhaps the deepest mystery of faith. The paradoxical truth that sometimes what feels like abandonment is actually invitation. What seems like loss is secretly gain. What appears to be ending is actually beginning. This doesn't mean we should seek out suffering or glorify rejection, but it does suggest that when these experiences find us, as they inevitably will, they need not have the final word. They can become, instead, thresholds to transformation, doorways to deeper life, opportunities for unexpected grace. The story of the 8-year-old boy who prayed alone after being rejected, who encountered Ignatius in a dream, and whose life was gradually transformed through that meeting, reminds us that our prayers are never truly unanswered, though the answers may come in forms we neither expect nor immediately recognize. It suggests that rejection, whether from others or apparently from God, need not define us, but can become, paradoxically, the birthplace of a more authentic belonging. And it offers hope that the silence that sometimes surrounds our deepest prayers may contain not divine abandonment, but a deeper kind of presence, one that speaks not in obvious interventions, but in the slow, patient transformation of our hearts. In your own experiences of rejection or apparent divine silence, may you discover, like Ignatius, like our young boy, the unexpected grace that often hides within life's most painful moments. May you find, in what initially seems like absence, a deeper kind of presence. And may the God who often works most powerfully in darkness and silence reveal himself to you in ways that transform not just your circumstances, but your very capacity to see, to love, and to hope. For in the end, this is the promise that emerges from Ignatian spirituality, that nothing is wasted, that all can be integrated, that every experience, even rejection, can become a pathway to deeper communion with the God who waits for us, not just in light, but also in darkness, not just in acceptance, but also in rejection, not just in answers, but also in silence. In the final years of his life, our protagonist reflects on the full arc of his journey from that wounded 8-year-old boy to the person he has become. He remembers the playground rejections with a clarity that hasn't dimmed with time, yet now these memories carry a different emotional weight. What once felt like devastating exclusion now appears as the fertile ground from which his deepest values and most meaningful work have grown. The tears shed in childhood prayers that seemed to go unanswered have, in retrospect, watered the seeds of a faith more resilient and nuanced than might have developed through easier paths. As he sits in his garden one evening, performing the exam that has structured his spiritual life for decades, he experiences a moment of profound gratitude, not despite his early wounds, but because of how they've been transformed. In this moment of clarity, he recognizes that the rejection that once seemed only harmful contained within it the invitation to a deeper form of belonging, one not dependent on social acceptance or worldly success, but rooted in the unwavering love of God. This recognition doesn't romanticize suffering or suggest that rejection is good in itself, but it does affirm that even our deepest wounds can be integrated into a life of meaning and purpose, that nothing need be wasted if we remain open to the mysterious ways divine love works within even our most painful experiences. Perhaps this is the deepest wisdom that emerged from that childhood dream encounter with Ignatius, a truth that has taken a lifetime to fully comprehend. That often, our seemingly unanswered prayers receive responses far more profound than what we initially sought, and that sometimes, divine silence conceals a communication too deep for words, a presence that transforms us not by removing our difficulties, but by meeting us within them and gradually changing how we see, feel, and respond to the world around us.